Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Digital Dole Institute. We're delighted you could join us for a very important program tonight, the Dole Lecture. The Dole Lecture is one of the signature programs at the Institute of Politics, and we especially focus on it because it honors the day in April of 1944 when Senator Bob Dole was severely injured in World War II in Italy. So it's a great honor to always host the guests for this program. To begin with, let me tell you that the Political Science Department of the University of Kansas is a gracious co-sponsor tonight. We thank them for that. And it's now my duty and pleasure to introduce the Chancellor of the University of Kansas, a very good friend of the Dole Institute, Chancellor Doug GIROD. Chancellor?
Good evening and welcome to the Digital Dole Institute of Politics for the 2021 Dole Lecture. My name is Doug GIROD and I'm Chancellor here at the University of Kansas. And tonight's discussion will be moderated by Bill Lacy, Director of the Institute. Our guest this evening is Ambassador of Belgium to the United States, Jean-Arthur Régibeau. Ambassador Régibeau is the second seated ambassador to be a guest at the Dole Institute. He joined the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1998, and in 2007, he was appointed Director General in charge of multilateral organizations at the Foreign Ministry. In 2016, Ambassador Régibeau took up his role as ambassador to the Russian Federation, Armenia, Belarus, and Uzbekistan. He presented his credentials as Ambassador of the Kingdom of Belgium to the United States of America on September 17, 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Jean-Arthur Régibeau.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us tonight digitally. We really appreciate it and are honored to have you here.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's an honor.
Well, let's get right to it. I know our guests want to know more about you personally. Could you begin by telling us a little bit about your upbringing and education?
Yes, for sure. So I was born in 1962 in the French-speaking part of Belgium, but actually only 20 kilometers far from the Flemish-speaking part of Belgium, which is also 20 kilometers far from the Netherlands, where you speak Dutch, and 40 kilometers from Germany, where you speak German. So really, it's a special corner, not only of Belgium, but of Europe. And all the more appropriate because my father was Belgian, French-speaking, and my mother was Swiss, German-speaking. And that's very important in the sense that every summer we spent holidays with the Swiss family. And so I grew up with Swiss German in my hair. And it's still a language that speaks to my heart to this day. So I would say that French is my native language, but actually Swiss German is my mother's language. I pursued very classical humanities in Liège, in my home city, studying Latin, Greek, French literature, and I chose law at university, probably not by happenstance because it was also the studies that my father had chosen, but probably not for exactly the same reason. In Belgium, law is the matter of choice, also if you're interested in political science. You have the opposite in France, for example, where people interested in political science would go to Sciences Po, which is well known. In Belgium, most of these people choose law. And I found it very appropriate, since I had a very good legal education, but you also develop the understanding that law is so interconnected with politics. It's not only that politicians vote the law in our democracies, but also that law is a reflection upon our society. Sometimes it's just admitting what is existing, but sometimes it's also trying to change society as it is. And given this international background, it will be no surprise to you that after 5 years of a law degree in Belgium, I decided to move to the Netherlands, the neighboring country, but mainly to speak Dutch, to learn Dutch language, which is very important in Belgium. It is the language spoken by a majority of Belgians, 60%, and 40% speak French. We also have a small German-speaking minority, about 1% of the population. But for a Belgian, it's very important to be bilingual so that you can converse in all languages within the administration and the political institutions of the country. But also, in addition to that, I had much interest in international law, public law, but also EU law, the law of the European Union. And all that I studied in the Netherlands in Dutch. And after that, since my primary interest was also with politics, I decided to study in English in an American university, and I was very happy and fortunate to be admitted by the Bologna Center of the Johns Hopkins University. And I spent over there a fantastic academic year, small groups, seminars, rather than just the teacher speaking to the students. It was very dynamic. We had a lot of readings. And after that, we would come to discuss it among students. And the basic principle of Johns Hopkins in Bologna is that you have more or less 50% of American students and 50% of other countries, mainly Europeans, of course. And I really remember one discussion with an American friend who obviously was a Republican. It was the time of Ronald Reagan back in 1986. And it was a class on Atlantic Alliance security issues, which is of importance to both of us, both Americans and Europeans. And we can come back to that later because it's also a very current topic. And of course, I was giving a European point of view, for example, on the Euro missiles and the rivalry with the Soviet Union at the time. And after the class, this American friend came to me and said, well, you know, we are the leader of the free world. Why don't you just follow our leadership? And I told him, since I was very surprised by this type of stance, because we were in a democratic setting, we are all democracies, I told him, well, if it is your opinion, NATO might just disappear within the next few years, because NATO is about democracy and everybody is entitled to have his own opinion. And the strength of NATO lies in coming to an understanding among allies. And I think that he was as shocked as I had been. And at that point, I really learned something about the transatlantic relations. Is first that you can be very frank with each other. You will listen to each other, but you will also come to an understanding of what it means to be very good allies. And I think that the history since World War II has been a very good example for that, not just for the current time, but I think throughout history. And after that, I was recruited by a Belgian bank, Bank Brussels Lambert, which no longer exists. It's been taken over by a Dutch bank, ING. I worked for 3 years over there, including a 6 months traineeship in New York, the New York branch. So I was there at the time of the financial crisis in October 1987. So also a very good, interesting time to learn what's moving on, not just in the world, but specifically in the financial capital of the world, New York. And a few years later, I was really tempted by a strange experience, given my background, all the degrees I had. I decided to become a tour guide for Belgian tourists visiting the United States. And the condition was to be trilingual, French and Dutch, to talk to Belgian tourists, but of course also English, because these were tours in America. And that these were 2 years of fantastic experience. First, because I had to deal with people. Most of them were much older than I was. And just to try to lead a group of 40 people is a challenge in itself. And you have to pay attention to everyone's need. But by the same token, I had a chance to visit the United States from east to west, mainly the East Coast, from Niagara Falls to Miami, and the West Coast from San Francisco to Los Angeles, but going through all these magnificent national parks in the West, that remains just a fantastic memory for me. And after that, I was involved in politics. I was much interested in the way that our own system, democratic system, was working, but also I've always been a strong supporter of democracy and freedom. And this I will probably talk about later when you will mention Mr. Dole's roles in Italy in 1944. But suffice to say that when I was a student at the age of 20, I had a kind of enlightenment when I was reading a book by a French political scientist, very well known in Europe, much less in America, unfortunately, Raymond Aron. And maybe you might know Jean-Paul Sartre. Jean-Paul Sartre is a well-known French writer. He was a communist, and for a long time he was a supporter of the Soviet Union. And Raymond Aron was at the same time a colleague of Jean-Paul Sartre because they were students together, but he was at the exact opposite in terms of political spectrum. He was a liberal and a fierce supporter of democracy. And he was also a theorist of international relations. And at the age of 20, my father had died 3 years earlier. I had a kind of enlightenment when I was reading Raymond Aron about international politics, international relations. And I decided at that point, well, that's exactly what I want to do in my life. And whenever you look at my CV, you could see that there is always an international dimension. And so I came to work for the Belgian Senate for a political party, the Social Democrats, in 1995. Focusing on tax issues, but also on the European Union, no surprise. And I happened to succeed in becoming a diplomat in 1998. It's one of the most competitive exams in Belgium. So you don't have to be only interested in international relations, you also have to be a bit lucky to go through this difficult exam. And so now for 22, 23 years almost, I've been a diplomat, working for our defense minister for 7 years. I've been 1 year at the embassy in Berlin. As you mentioned, 9 years as a political director, director general in charge of multilateral organizations, 4 years in Moscow until September last year, and now in Washington for almost 8 months, and very happy to be here.
Yes, I sounds like a fantastic career that you've had. We appreciate your sharing that. Can you tell us what you do as an ambassador? Just kind of describe it.
Yes, maybe focusing on the different area we're working on. Obviously, in Washington, our main focus is political, and we are following for two reasons. First, of course, the United States being the largest power in the world has an influence on almost all issues. And many of these issues are also of interest to Belgium and the European Union. The European Union, whenever it takes a decision in foreign policy, it has to be consensual. So every country can contribute, but also has to agree to the common position. So whenever you speak of the Horn of Africa or Pakistan or Chile, we need to be informed about what's going on, but also about the opinion of the United States. So it's a main topic for us. The second main topic I would say is economic, because the United States is also the largest economic power in the world. It's a very big trading partner, including for Belgium. Our main trading partners are our neighbors, no surprise, Germany, France, and the Netherlands in that order. But number 4 is the United States. And we have a lot of American investment in Belgium, but also a lot of Belgian investments in the United States, worth about 60,000 jobs. So it's not insignificant. And so part of the role of the embassy is also to support business development and our companies whenever they meet questions or problems on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, the third issue is consular. It's more directed to Belgian citizens living in the United States. We're acting a bit like the city hall for them. So we're handling their passport, identity cards, legal acts, and so on. And also, we're trying to give some visibility to the name of Belgium. We are a tiny country the size of Maryland, but with a population of 11 million. And we are hosting both NATO and the European Union in our capital city, Brussels. So we are trying to inform the American public about what Belgium is, what our values are, our vision of the world in a dialogue, in a respectful dialogue. And we're also willing to explore the European Union because we are one member state, a founding member state, and we're trying to explain to an American public what it means to be a member of the European Union, how it works, because we understand that seen from far away, it's not always easy to understand. I can tell you that being a member states, sometimes it's a bit puzzling to us as well. But the key issue is that it's been working now for 70 years, and we all feel the better for that. It doesn't mean that the European Union has no issue of its own. We do have many. We can talk about it later. But we believe, and we strongly believe, that it has been a tremendous success for our citizens.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much, sir. Could you talk a little bit about how the pandemic has changed the way you do your job and also how the pandemic has been handled in Belgium?
Well, it has changed a lot, our work a lot, because by definition, our role is to meet with people. It's a contact job, and that's why I like it. It's to meet as many people as I can within a single day. And of course, with the pandemic, we are pretty limited. But I must say that here in Washington, I've been happy enough to have a big residence in Georgetown, and still abiding by the local rules of DC. I can still receive up to 10 people for a dinner or for lunch, because we have a very large dining room, and while respecting social distancing, I can still entertain guests, which is a big advantage. But of course, no way to organize a big reception for a national day or something like that. Even outside, we're currently limited to 50 people. And I hope that the rules will be somewhat relaxed in June and July, because we have events coming up, the National Day on 21st of July, and the European Football Championships that we would like to promote for a larger public here in Washington. The pandemic has changed the job a lot. And just to give you another example, once a year, normally, all Belgian ambassadors converge to Brussels, where we meet with our government, Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, Finance Minister, etc., just to have a feel of what's going on in our own country, because we are representing our own country abroad. But this year, this meeting had to happen on internet. And so it's quite a big difference of not being able to chat with colleagues, not just during the formal meetings, but also in the corridors, during the coffee break, etc. Also, on a more personal level, it limits our life, just like for everyone. It was much more difficult to meet with our friends, with our family. And so we have to show patience and mainly to work before a screen, just like we are doing tonight. When it comes to the pandemic in Belgium, well, we've been badly hit. We have to admit that, especially the second wave in the fall last year. So numbers were not good. We had a lot of people in intensive care units. We almost reached the limits. We had to apply the principle of solidarity between regions within Belgium, sometimes also with neighboring countries like France, Germany, and the Netherlands. We certainly have too many people who died of this pandemic, unfortunately, like many countries in Europe. But on the whole, I would say that quite strict rules set by the governments were mostly well abided by the population, and that's why every time we were able to move out of these waves. We are now witnessing the end of a third wave. The situation is not as good as I can see it here in Washington, but it's clearly improving. And the government is also relaxing rules. And for example, a terrace on restaurant will be open starting May the 8th. And so we hope that we will enjoy maybe not a totally normal summer, but a much more normal summer than last year.
Very good. Mr. Ambassador, you referenced NATO a little bit earlier. Could you tell us the importance of the NATO relationship in Europe?
Well, it's key. Let me just give you the example of Belgium. We've also been among the founding members in 1949, and it's just based on historical experience. There is a fact that is not well known about Belgium. If you look at a map of Europe, and for every battle in the last 400 years, you put a dot on the map of Europe. Actually, right at the center of the map, you will see a heavy concentration. And this concentration is nowadays the territory of Belgium. This was true for the wars of Louis XIV, the French king, the Napoleonic Wars, just Waterloo, which is a well-known name. It's 15 kilometers south of Brussels, our capital. Well, the First World War, the Flanders Field, World War II, the Battle of the Bulge. And so we in Belgium, we know what war means. We have had on our soil. And as a consequence, we are rather pacifist people. On both occasions, World War I and World War II, we tried the policy of neutrality, sitting just in the middle between France and Germany. But both times, the German Empire decided to invade and to attack France through Belgian territory. So both times, I would say that the policy of neutrality failed. And there has been a major change after 1945. First of all, there was the decision of all European countries, all totally destroyed by World War II, to work together rather than to fight each other. And that's a major difference. But also, as our Prime Minister at the time, Paul-Henri Spaak, said, we are afraid, and we were afraid of the Soviet might that was clearly perceived as a threat to our freedoms, just barely recuperated from the Nazi regime. And it looked entirely natural to us to keep the alliance in wartime, because our country was liberated by mainly American, British, Canadian, French troops. So to keep this alliance alive, so that it would also be a guarantee for our security towards the future. And we still look at NATO in this way. Both NATO and the EU are the pillars of our foreign policy, but also of our security policy. NATO more on the military side, and the EU for all other aspects, like the economic aspects, technological, and so on, because security is not only about the military, it's also about all other aspects of life. And so for us, we need both NATO and the EU. These are both pillars on which our security and our well-being rest.
What are the most important issues, Mr. Ambassador, for the Belgian-United States relationship? What are the kinds of issues that you address most often in this country?
Well, the future of transatlantic relations, because it's not just about Belgium. As I explained to you, our foreign policy is multilateral. We know that we are just a country of 11 million in a world that has more than 7 billion human beings. And so we are a small island. So we have to take account whoever is around us, but also the rest of the world. And if we look at the current shape of the world, we can see that there is a lot to be very happy with. The fact that Europe has been not only united, but also peaceful and wealthy for the last 70 years. But also we have to be aware that there might be some danger, some threat around us in the world, not just about the pandemic, but also economic challenges, maybe military threat if we don't pay attention. And that's why we look at the transatlantic relationship as a cornerstone of our foreign policy, both for NATO, of which the US is a member, but also for the EU, because we see the relationship between the United States and the European Union as much as a cornerstone as NATO is. And so the fact that we are able to have this dialogue across the Atlantic is simply existential for us. If we did not have this type of relationship, there would be a big question mark about our future.
Are there any points of tension, Mr. Ambassador, between the United States and Belgium, or do we have a very strong relationship?
Well, if you mention Belgium particularly, well, no. And to be frank, it does not always make my job easy, in the sense that if I want to request a meeting for my prime minister with your president, the answer would be, well, where is the problem? What should we talk about? We are very good friends. So we do not have any severe issues. We might have sometimes diverging views, For example, it's well known that Belgium was opposed to the Iraq War in 2003. But we quickly reconciled, and that's a very good point with Americans, is that we can not only agree to disagree, is that we are trying really to understand the point of view of the other side and to include it in our own reasoning, to take it into account. And I must emphasize that this is true in both directions. So also the United States listening even to a smaller country like Belgium on important issues. So that's why we believe it's a crucial relationship, and we want to keep it that way.
Many Americans today believe that our politics is not working very well for our country and that the polarization is bad. I'm curious, what are general Belgian attitudes about US politics today?
Well, I can only emphasize what you said, because I mentioned the point of interest for our embassy is US foreign policy, but I must say that in the last few years and currently it's also US domestic policy, because I think that the American public has to realize that domestic politics is important to American citizens, of course, but it's important to Democrats everywhere in the world. Because if democracy was seen to be failing in the United States, it would be a disaster for Democrats everywhere in the world, and especially in my part of the world. We also face populist challenges. We have Russia as a neighbor that is an authoritarian regime, clearly. And so if we could not base our own existence and security policy on a strong relationship with the democratic United States, as I mentioned, that would be an existential threat to my country.
Okay. Um, could you talk a little bit about, you obviously, as you said in one of your early answers, know multiple languages. Could you talk about the challenge of the language barrier in diplomacy?
Oh, in diplomacy. I think that now most diplomats, if not all, are used to use English as a lingua franca. So all of us, we speak English. And the funniest thing is that even after Brexit, even South, aside Ireland, of course, no country has English as the official language. We still continue to speak English during meetings of the European Union. And sometimes it's not just a question of accents, but also you can see the original native language through the way we speak English, also the words, the grammar, etc. And I must say that language, if we talk about among diplomats and politicians at the highest level, most of the time it's not an issue. And for me, since we all speak English, it's not an issue in the United States. But during my time in Russia, it certainly was an issue. I arrived in Russia without speaking Russian. And I quickly realized that if I wanted to connect with Russian people, not just the Russian government, but Russian people, to try to understand their way of living, their way of thinking, I had to learn some Russian. I'm not perfect. I don't speak the language fluently, but enough so that, for example, I could read a speech in Russian, and that I can at least begin a conversation in Russian. And this was always taken as a sign of respect by my Russian counterpart. And so even if we would disagree on some political issues, and sometimes we would agree on other issues, because we also have agreements with Russians, the fact that we could connect through the language was essential. It's a human dimension. It's psychological, it's the human feeling. If you can have it, then I think you're a much better diplomat for that. And if I can come back to the previous question about democracy in the United States, because it's full of issues we also have in our own countries. And just let me give the example of my own country. As I said, we have 3 official languages, 2 main ones, Flemish in the north and French in the south. And the linguistic issues has been at the heart of our political life throughout our history, and our country was born in 1830. And still today, it's the topic of heavy and sometimes heated debate in Belgium. But we never have violence, and that's a key. And so we have two different culture. Flemish people it's a Germanic language. French speaking, it's a Latin language, obviously. We have two different culture, and you can add the German speaking people to that. But I think that we have developed throughout the years, maybe because we've been throughout history dominated by empires, imperial powers like France, Austria, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain. We have a healthy habit of listening to each other. Does not mean that an agreement comes very easily. Sometimes it lasts for years. For 10 years, we can deal with a single political issues about who is able to vote in a small village just close to Brussels. Are French-speaking voters able to vote for a French-speaking candidate, or should they only be able to vote for a Flemish-speaking candidate because it's Flanders, even though it's 5 kilometers from Brussels, which is itself a bilingual city. So you can see the type of issue very sensitive because it involves identity. And we have a history also between the two languages, because our country used to be dominated by a French-speaking elite, and now we have the Flemish-speaking population that is clearly more numerous than the French-speaking one. The South used to be richer in the 19th century. Now it is the opposite. But even with this tense, I would say, tense environment, we always come to peaceful solutions. They are not always pretty to see. It sometimes just underlines our reputation for surrealism. And you can have slightly different version of the same law if you compare the Flemish version and the French version. But we have not only peace, we also still have a national character. And I can mention, for example, just national football team, which is very, very popular in my country, but much more beyond that. All Belgians, whatever their language, would agree on the fact that we like beer, we like chocolate, we like our fries, we like our waffles, and we like to party together. So we have intense debate whenever we are in Belgium, but if you happen, as a French speaking, as I am, to meet a Fleming on holidays in Spain, you will just take a beer and drink together and laugh for 3 hours. So that's the story of Belgium, and that's why we really praise democracy. And so that's why we clearly encourage everyone in Europe, but I would say across the world, if we want to sustain democracy, to be attentive to what other people are saying. So it's very important to show that you want to understand the other people, even if at the end you know that you will not agree, but at least you respect the point of view of the other side. And at the end of the day, especially if, for example, the standard of living is at stake in Belgium, even the Socialist Party on the left and the Liberal Party, which means rather conservative on our side, more about liberal economics, but liberal in the sense of the School of Chicago, like Milton Friedman. So even these parties can come together and find a solution. And we also have a tradition of companies talking to trade unions to manage social security, the level of salaries, etc. It's a different system from the United States. We fully realize that. But in the end, we always come to a solution because we know that it is necessary for the well-being of our citizens. And our politicians realize that if they do not accept the principle of dialogue and compromise, then they will be voted out next time.
Mr. Ambassador, how would Brexit affect the European Union, and what is Belgium's general attitude towards it?
Well, first, it certainly decreased our strengths. We go from a bit more than 500 million people to 450, more or less, and we lose one of the major economies in the world, which is Britain. So it's really a pity. It's also a pity because it means that we did not succeed in convincing our British friends that actually the European Union is the way for the future, not just for the past. And we strongly feel about it, especially in Belgium. It will have an impact because obviously Britain being a neighboring country, just 60 kilometers across the sea, it's still a major economic partner on the par more or less with the United States for Belgium. And so it means that trade is already getting a bit more difficult. And over time, rules will tend to diverge, which makes economic relations also a bit more difficult. It's exactly the opposite of what we want, Belgium. Belgium is by essence a trade nation, and we want as open a border as possible. But our general attitude is that we regret the choice of the British citizens, but we respect it because it is a democratic choice. So we are not happy about this development, but I think that the European Union has shown already in the past, also in the recent past, that it is very strong to resist this type of challenge, and we are looking towards the future because, as I mentioned already, to Belgian people, the EU is existential.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got two questions left, and I would encourage our audience, if you have questions, please send your questions to Dole Questions at ku.edu. That's Dole Questions at ku.edu. Mr. Ambassador, one of the disappointments that we have in hosting you virtually instead of personally is that we don't get to meet you and that you don't get to meet our incredible students who are associated with the Dole Institute. I was wondering, could you share some thoughts and advice for students who are interested in public service or the Foreign Service?
Yes, definitely. Travel as much as you can, especially when you're young. First, it's easier when you're young. You can travel the world with a backpack. You can meet a lot of people, and young people meet easily on the road. You will meet great people. They will still be your friends 40 years later. And you will learn about the world, not just about your own country, but you will also be proud to speak about your own experience in your country. And it's also a way of making publicity for your own country when you go outside. So going outside, even if you plan a career for example, in the U.S. administration, in U.S. government, I think that you always benefit from contact with other people. And also, if I can give this type of advice, is please try to learn a foreign language, whichever it is, because it opens not just your knowledge, it's also open to your mind, to other way of thinking, other way of looking at literature, of looking at the world, and of looking at tomorrow. And you will make also great friends just by learning foreign languages. Here it could be French or Spanish, because these are two other languages used in North America. But frankly, any other language you would learn will make you much more richer in the human dimension. So that's a strong advice I give to you. Coming from a small country where it's not just something we do because we like it, but really because we feel we need it.
Okay, my final question tonight, Mr. Ambassador, is as you referenced earlier, the Dole Lecture is done every time in April or May annually to remember Senator Dole's wound in Italy fighting in World War II. What can you say about the sacrifice of Bob Dole, but also other Americans and all the nations that fought during World War II on behalf of the Allies?
Well, let me be very direct about it. It's very simple, and I will explain a bit. Had it not been for the presence of US soldiers in Europe in World War II, I would simply not be here. My father was a partisan during World War II. He was opposed to Nazism, opposed to foreign occupation of our country, and he was a strong Democrat, but also a socialist, because he was the son of a worker and he believed in social justice. But for him, the overriding argument was, I want to be free. And from the very first day of the war, he fought against Nazis. And in March 1942, he was arrested by the Gestapo. The Gestapo, for those of you who do not know, was the secret state police of the Nazi regime. And he spent 3 years in Nazi concentration camps. And actually, he was in Dachau in April 1945 when he was liberated by the 7th US Army. So had it not been for the sacrifice of American soldiers in Europe, I would simply not be here.
Well, thank you very much for those comments. We're going to go to audience questions, and I would just like to remind our audience who are joining us right now and watching, if you have a question, please send that question to dolequestions@ku.edu, dolequestions@ku.edu. Our first question is from Debbie. What is Belgium doing to mitigate terrorism and extremism in the area?
You mean in our own country? That's how I
Yes,
understand
and
it.
let's say in Europe as well.
Yeah. Well, these are two different aspects. First, in our own country, as you might imply, indeed, we had terrorist attacks in 2016, and we were hit badly, both in the metro system and at the airport. That was a very nasty surprise to many Belgians, because most of these terrorists were on ground. And so it meant that somewhere we had made mistakes. Probably the kind of mistakes we had made is that we did not pay attention enough to integrate the migrants in Belgium. But probably we also made a mistake in our foreign policy. And just to give you an example, there has been an inquiry by Parliament about these events, of course, because we were shaken by these. And there was a kind of contract, if you want, between Belgium and Saudi Arabia about managing the Great Mosque in Brussels. But unfortunately, we came to the conclusion that this management had encouraged an extremist version of Islam. So not a moderate Islam that we can easily integrate in any democratic setting, but an extremist, a violent version of Islam that we simply cannot accept. And as a result, we decided to terminate this contract between Saudi Arabia and the Great Mosque and to put management in other hands. So that's just an example about Belgium. Now, at the European level, the key, of course, is cooperation with all other countries. Because it's not just Belgium facing this threat. In Europe nowadays, it's mainly Islamist threat, terrorist threat, but there are other types of terrorism, of course, and we have to be aware of them too. So, for example, through the mechanism of the European Union, we exchange information among police, among justice, among intelligence services. And it helps us, even so if it's not always advertised in the newspapers, to prevent new terrorist attacks. And since we all face more or less the same type of challenge as the one I mentioned about Belgium, it's also very positive and even necessary to exchange experience with other European countries, but also beyond Europe. You know that we have a lot of political difference with Russia. But sometimes Russians also face terrorist threat, for example, from Chechnya. And this is one of the areas where we have a very good cooperation with Russia when it comes to operationally countering the terrorist threat.
Okay, our next question is from Kara and a number of other SAB students. Our SAB is our Student Advisory Board, I should say, Mr. Ambassador, and for the audience. But a question from her and some of them is, on a day-to-day basis, what is the most challenging part of being an ambassador?
Whoa. Well, frankly, I love my job so much that I do not see any big challenge, except that sometimes when I meet so many people during a day, I'm very happy to sit in the sofa at 8 in the evening with the cat on my laps and reading a book. But besides that, frankly, I do not see many challenges because over time, we learn to deal with not only difficult issues, but also to try to moderate the way we express ourselves when we are not happy about something. Maybe that might be the most challenging part when internally inside yourself you're fuming about something, but you cannot express it because you're a diplomat, especially if you're an ambassador. So you have to keep quiet and express in a very quiet way a disagreement. But over time, it comes naturally to you.
Okay, very good, sir. Thank you. Tyler asks, do you believe the monarchies of Europe will continue in the future to play roles in international affairs?
Well, actually, yes and no. But the way our monarchies in Europe function are special in the sense that no king or queen really has the power in our countries. And the Belgian monarchy functions more or less as the British monarchy. So every decision taken by the king has to be approved by the government. And the government, of course, rests on a majority, a democratic majority in parliament. But there is still an important legal role because all laws have also to be signed by the king. But the king would sign everything that comes from parliament. So that's the respect of democracy. And I think that in several countries in Europe, just like ours, monarchy still plays a very important role in symbolizing the state. But in terms of crisis, for example, just like now, the pandemic, the head of states also has to play a role to listen to the population. And so it's not just the job of the government, but also of the head of state, in our case, the king, willing to meet with people, to visit hospitals, to listen to the concern of the sick people, of the nurses, the doctors. I think it's also a way of expressing consideration, not just from the king himself, but from the whole community, as a sign of recognizing the important role of people working in the health system, for example.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Frank, and it's about labor unions. What roles do labor unions play in Belgium?
Well, very important because we have a system that is very similar to Germany, where, as I mentioned, we regulate the economy through a dialogue between companies and the unions. And so you have a kind of balance between these two sides. And for example, they are in charge of managing social security because the money from social security comes both from the companies who have to pay a share of the salaries to social security, but also a share of the salaries coming from the workers. So everyone has an interest in a properly run system that delivers first a very sound and good health policy, but also for an affordable cost. And for example, that's a very good example because it surprised me when I looked at the figure. In the United States, you spent about 16% of your GDP on health. In Belgium, it's only 8%. And still, we have a very good health system. And it is managed on a par by the companies and the unions. And the government intervenes only if they cannot find an agreement, which does not happen very often, because they prefer to keep the government out of their business and make an agreement themselves. So the part of unions is very important. I would say stabilizing both the economic and the social aspects of living together in Belgium.
Our next question is from Mark, and he asks about the importance of Olympics in international relations.
Well, I would not overemphasize the importance of the Olympics, except for one fact. I think it's a bit like in the spirit of the United Nations. It is to show that we can set all political differences and other type of difference we all have here as human beings aside and concentrate on something like sport. And in that respect, I think that the Olympic ritual every 4 years is something excellent. It helps us discover the world, but also respect each other as athletes, and beyond athletes, also as citizens of the earth.
Okay, I think we have some more questions. Yes, we have one from Emmett. What is the Belgian government stance regarding the rift in NATO with Turkey?
Well, I would say that we certainly have some disagreements with Turkey, just like the United States has. Belgium, for example, has recognized the Armenian genocide in our parliament quite a few years ago. We do not like when they sent their navy to protect exploration vessels in the Mediterranean in violation of what we believe to be international law. And we prefer to engage in a dialogue rather than a show of force. But still, we recognize Turkey as being an important ally of NATO, and we just try to implement our general policy when it comes to foreign policy. It's engage in dialogue rather than in confrontation. And so we hope that together with our other NATO allies, at the end of the day, we can find agreements with Turkey that is not just good for Turkey and other member states, but also for NATO as a whole. Because as I said earlier, NATO plays a crucial role in our security policy.
We have a very good question that may challenge your memory just a little bit here from Matthew. Do you have a favorite story from an opportunity you've received from being an ambassador?
Yes, I would say going to Russia. Because that's a neighbor. You just have 2 hours and 30 minutes flight between Brussels and Moscow, which is much less than coming to New York, for example. It's 8 hours flight. And I realized how little we know about Russia. And that's really a pity because on one side, it is a competitor. It's an authoritarian regime. It's a totally different culture from ours. But on the other side, it's a great culture and it's a great people. And one very good surprise from my stay in Moscow is how open and warm Russian people can be. And so sometimes it's very good as an ambassador to be involved in contact people to people rather than government to government, which are more codified. And then we have just to stand by political instructions. And just let it go, just meet people on a human basis, I think is the most wonderful opportunity you can have as an ambassador.
I have a question, sir, from David. Are there any tariff issues between Belgium and the United States that you are involved with and working on?
And what type of issue, excuse me?
Tariff issues.
Oh, tariff. Yes, but not directly. Because these issues are dealt with by the European Union. And so I am not negotiating with the United States. The European Union is doing it on our behalf because we decided, the member states of the European Union, that we would be much stronger if we presented a united face to the world, not just to the US. We do the same with China, Japan, Australia, etc. And so our role actually is mainly played in Brussels, the EU's capital, where all together the 27 members of the European Union define our negotiating stance. And then the representative of the European Union would come to Washington and discuss with Americans. So if you have questions about tariff, you should actually not come to me, the Belgian ambassador, but to the ambassador of the European Union in Washington.
Okay, thank you. That was very helpful response, sir. We're running out of time, but I still have time for a few more questions if anybody cares to send them to dolequestions@ku.edu. Brianna asked, what is Belgium doing to curb human rights violations?
Well, first we have to take care of our own domestic polity. I think that human rights support begins at home. And this is a very appropriate question because just today we had the Universal Periodic Review of Belgium before the Committee of Human Rights in Geneva. So we believe it's a very good way of promoting human rights across the world, including in Belgium. We are a democracy and we have a strong constitution, but we do not claim to be perfect. And I think that leading by example is the best thing we can do. And for example, today in Geneva, questions were raised about some police brutality against demonstrations, about the status of prisoners and the status of jails in Belgium. And we realize and we recognize that there are also aspects of human rights that we can improve in Belgium itself. And so, so doing, I think that we're also helping human rights elsewhere by setting a trend, an example. But of course, we're not doing it alone. And there again, we're doing it primarily through the European Union. Human rights is a strong part of the Belgian foreign policy, but also of the EU's foreign policy. So it's an issue we always engage about with other partners, including the United States. For example, we have a dialogue on the death penalty. We encourage the United States to abandon death penalty. But we have this type of dialogue with all countries. Well, sometimes with some countries it's more difficult than with others. Of course, if we are speaking human rights with Russia and China, it's not that easy, that's for sure. But we try also to relay the opinion of citizens in these countries. For example, Russia is still a member of the Council of Europe, not to be confused with the European Council, which is something of the European Union. The Council of Europe is supporting the European Charter on Human Rights. And all member states, including Russia, including Turkey, have promised that they would abide by the principle of this charter. That would be very common and usual for you. And it means that there is also a European Court for Human Rights with judges coming from all member states. And so, for example, this court would welcome complaints coming from Russian citizens and from Turkish citizens when they are not happy about respect for human rights in their respective countries. And I'm not saying that this is a solution for all problems, but you would be surprised to see that even in the case of Russia, well, Russian government would just abide by the decision of the judges of the Court of Human Rights. So that's one way we support human rights across the world. Of course, I could multiply examples because unfortunately abuses for human rights are present everywhere in the world.
We have a question from Doug. Apart from COVID, what are the most challenging issues Belgium is facing today?
I would say the economy, because our economy did not come to a standstill. I would say that the situation in Europe is a bit like in the United States. Many people were able to work from home. Some people had to go to their workplace, like hospitals. But many students also stay at home, the teachers as well. And it means that there is a net economic loss for many economic operators, just like think of cinemas, restaurants, other companies like organizing a big music festival. And so we are now going to face the consequence of the pandemic, the absence of revenues for all these companies. They got tremendous support from all our governments, just like in the United States. But it also means that we have a larger amount of debt. We are running a larger deficit, and eventually this deficit has to come down. How we will do it is still a question mark. It's open for debate. It's a really living debate in Europe. There are many different solutions. But really what we want to do now is to relaunch our economy beyond the pandemic.
Mr. Ambassador, we have one final audience question tonight. It's from Kate. You referenced travel a few minutes ago. Kate asked, how often do you travel back to Belgium? And do you spend a lot of your time traveling or flying?
Well, I would say in normal times, yes. So, for example, I was a director general in the foreign ministry for 9 years, a long period, but I would travel twice a month. And normally that would be the same here as an ambassador to Washington, because Washington is not the United States. Part of my duty here in the United States is also to visit as many states as I can. And that would imply normally traveling twice a month. And sometimes it leads to a bit more work, because I remember applying for my U.S. visa, and a diplomat has also to apply, follow the procedure just like any normal citizen, except that we just tick the diplomatic box. And I had to make the list of all the countries I had visited in the world in the previous 5 years. Well, it was difficult to remember all of them, and I think that I came to a total of 70 countries. And yes, it's part of the job, but I would say it's also part of the pleasure of being a diplomat, because as I mentioned earlier, in my youth, that's also what I wanted to do, was to explore the world, see other countries, especially meet with other culture. And when you meet with diplomats from the Gulf region, for example, Saudi Arabia or the Emiratis, you clearly see from the very beginning that you come from two different worlds. And you just learn just by being in touch with other people. Or the Asian colleagues, diplomats, they have even another way of conducting diplomacy, and you learn a lot about their way of thinking, their way of looking at life. And I find it incredibly interesting, because really my motto in life is always to try to learn more.
Mr. Ambassador, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. You've been educational and entertaining, and I know I and our audience have enjoyed it enormously. Thank you very much, sir.
It was an honor. Thank you, Bill.
Yes, thank you so much. I hopefully will have a chance to meet you in person at some point. I want to thank our audience for joining us tonight. We do appreciate your support, and not only from Lawrence and the surrounding area. We've been joined by a lot of people from different parts of the country watching our programs during the pandemic. We appreciate that and look forward to continuing our YouTube channel in the fall, when we do our very heavy programming at the beginning of the fall semester. I want to let everybody know that next Tuesday afternoon at 3 p.m., our series on Voices from the Big First will continue with a program representing the Big First. This will feature Senator Pat Roberts, who just retired last year and left the United States Senate. We're delighted that the senator can take the time to join Audrey Coleman, our associate director. We'll be doing that interview that day. And again, thank you all for joining us tonight. Hope you enjoyed the program, and we'll see you next time. Thank you and good night.